Welcome for some more big martial knife content. Or are we talking about a short sword today? Yeah, we're in that size class again. And speaking of that size class, if you saw my recent video on the cold steel Cinquedea, oh my god, I think I actually pronounced it right that time, I was really impressed with that blade. How it handled, how it performed, yeah, really surprised me. I liked it a lot more than I thought I would. And that made me think about other sizable double-edged knives, big enough to potentially function as short swords as well, in history. And in that video I spoiled that today we would be taking a look at the cold steel Arkansas toothpick. So let's take a minute to talk about Arkansas toothpicks, and we'll take a close look at this one. Let's start where we usually do by talking about the sheath that it came with, and there is a lot to unpack here. Starting with the amount of mass it adds to your carry. Now, the toothpick alone weighs a pretty substantial 22 ounces, 624 grams. But with the sheath, that goes all the way up to 34 ounces, 964 grams. So hanging from my belt, it does indeed feel like I have, well, pretty much a full-size sword on my hip. However, percentage of that mass is in this really substantial thick leather frog that comes with a sizable thick belt loop that is on a swivel. So that's all nice. And this frog is removable. There's a button here, but unlike some of the other cold steel knives that have this sort of frog attached and this button stud that comes through it, there's no tab to flip off. It's just pushed through this leather ring, which means if I want to remove the sheath from it, I need to reach in there with something and pry it apart. And it's not something I really want to do. I found myself damaging the thing doing it. So right now I'm kind of leaving it this way, but considering the amount of mass here, I am thinking it might be easier to carry in the long run if I got rid of the frog and then just slipped the sheath into my belt across the small of my back, the facone carry style. So that's probably what I'm going to do going forward, but I wanted to show you it together. Now the sheath underneath, it's a thick leather sheath. There is no wood reinforcement or anything like that. It has a single seam that's very nicely stitched and a pretty ornate shape and also similar matching throat. Now retention is pretty good. It's not going anywhere accidentally, not much rattle to speak of at all in there. But one really interesting thing, a lot of these cold steel leather sheaths, especially some of the ones made in India for their swords, come with these really annoying thin plastic inserts that break down very quickly. The knives usually don't come with any extra liner, but for whatever reason, if you can see it in here, this one has got something in the mouth of the sheath on either side that looks to be the consistency of, well, cardstock. I don't know how well that's going to hold up. I haven't tore it up yet, but yeah, I'm going to say even though it does create a good fit for the blade, it's not very confidence-inspiring. But the rest of the sheath, yeah, it's a nice build. It's just massive. Before we get into this one any further, a little bit of history on the Arkansas toothpick. It is a contemporary of the Bowie knife. Now, does it predate the Bowie or postdate the Bowie? Well, not a lot of clear information on that. One theory is these were created by James Black, the smith who improved the design of the early Bowie, but you could certainly also argue that this bears a lot of resemblance to other sizable double-edged daggers in history, especially this one. But time-wise, that puts it in that mid-19th century period between the time when swords either became less popular to carry or were banned from carry in a lot of areas, and the availability of good revolvers. So something you can easily carry on your person, maybe even conceal, that gave you a lot of defensive and offensive options but I would certainly argue that the Bowie would function better also as a utility knife. Now, we're certainly going to put this to some tests, and I will make some comparisons with some of my sizable Bowies. But one other thing I wanted to point out is the motif on the pommel, and it's also repeated on the shape of the sheath. I believe is supposed to represent the crocodile horse of Arkansas. Alligator, Mike. It's an alligator horse. Someone once upon a time describing Arkansans, Arkansawyers, and it was Davy Crockett, as having the fierceness, toughness, tenacity of a crocodile, alligator, and a horse. If I could rest anywhere, it would be in Arkansas, where the men are of the real half-horse, half-alligator breed, such as grows nowhere else on the face of the universal earth. So I think that's what I'm looking at here. Either that or it's a crocodile. This alligator has had a serious accident. Time to talk about the friendly end. Now, we already talked about this crocodile horse motif on the pommel. It's an alligator. I think my problem is that snout looks just a lot like a crocodile. There are also some nice details down in the groove of the fuller. But speaking of details, I do want to start with one that is kind of bugging me and fit and finish wise. If you look at the slot where the blade goes through the guard, it's a pretty sizable rectangle. Bigger, I feel, than it needs to be, and that also tends to imply they probably squidged some epoxy down there to make sure everything stayed snug. Which means also, I think, construction-wise, we're looking at what we see a lot on cold steel made in India swords, where I expect, I haven't had it apart yet, tapered tang that is indeed threaded. There is a slot screw down here on the bottom. But back to the guard, I really do like this design. The double quillins with the little ball ends, very classical medieval look to it. And while it is squared off, I was worried there'd be hot spots, but in polishing it, they kind of dehorned it a little bit, and surprisingly, again, we'll talk about how it feels under impact and collision. Also a little worried potential hot spots for that deep groove in the fuller. Also not nearly as bad, spoiler alert, as I thought it would be, but one thing that's bugging me just a little bit, back to that fit and finish, is this painted black solwood grip isn't quite fit to the fuller, so there's some overhang here. Now I could easily fix that by filing and sanding it down, but that's going to take off the black paint, which I think I'm going to do to see what's underneath it, and, well, see what kind of finish I could create with, well, assuming it's a nice piece of wood. Now, it's an oval tapered grip with a bit of palm swell, and it's pretty substantial at its widest point. That's nearly 1.5 inches thick. Length from here to the corner of the pommel, that's a generous 5 inches, 14 centimeters. So that gives your hand a lot of options for position. We'll talk about that more in handling. But back to fit and finish. Okay, oval up at the top, but the closer it gets to the pommel, yeah, it starts to square off. Potential hot spot issues there, especially under impact or with extended handling. May have to make some changes there, but it almost has to do that in order to fit with the shape of the pommel, which is a very interesting, it almost looks like stacked steel plates, even though it's one cast piece. So I kind of aesthetically like what they did with it, even though it doesn't feel very good. Could I improve that? Certainly. But we'll talk about how it feels and how the build is held together more after the testing. Before we talk about the blade, what did I pay for the thing? I actually got it on sale at Amazon, but I think it's currently going for around $170 US. I'll put the link in the description, but definitely shop around. I've seen the prices on these flex a lot at different places. And for that, I'm getting a 1055 carbon steel blade, which is their common choice for swords. That, my files are telling me, somewhere in the low 50s HRC. Great for a sword. How does it hold up for something more knife-like? Now, I already talked about the weight, pretty substantial, 22 ounces, 624 grams, and we'll definitely see how that feels, moves, performs. With a point of balance, that is about 3/4 of an inch, about 2 centimeters into the blade. So it gives it a little bit of a blade forward characteristic, but not nearly as much as something like a Bowie knife. And again, we're going to make some comparisons. But it is a diamond cross-section blade. Is it hollow ground? Yes and no. Very interestingly, the way it's ground in the distal taper and everything like that, the top half of it is pretty much flat ground, maybe a little bit apple seeded, but the further it gets towards the guard, it starts to become slightly hollow ground, and that's also where you get a more pronounced secondary edge bevel, which is pretty rough and ragged. We'll take a look at how the edge is here in a second. Brushed finish, obviously the lines aren't too bad, and you have a little bit of ricasso down here. It's kind of small, but I found it's just big enough that I could safely finger the guard if I wanted to. But as for the dimensions, okay, your blade length is a sizable 13¼ inches, 33½ centimeters. Just I'm looking down at my notes to give you the metric as well as the imperial. The width of the blade at the base, the widest point, 1 7/8 of an inch, about 4½ centimeters. Does it have any distal taper? Surprisingly, just a little bit. Now, the ricasso down here is 5½ millimeters, but as soon as they get into the blade grind, that takes it down to 5. But going with the spine, 5 millimeters, and then if I stop about 1 inch, 2½ centimeters from the tip, that's down to 3½. So 5 to 3½. So there is a little bit of distal taper, which does affect the way it feels. So let's take a look at how the testing went. Quick edge test. Now, I haven't run it through the formal test battery yet, but this is also not the out-of-the-box edge. When I was out having way too much fun in the yard with my Cinquedea, I also took this out for the afternoon and used it to chop up some tree trimmings, making big branches into smaller pieces that would fit into my compost bin. And while I was doing that, I did put a little micro roll in one edge somehow. So took it to the shop and ran it briefly over my 1x30 belt sander, kind of an oversized work sharp. As I mentioned, very steep, rough, toothy secondary edge bevel, more sword-like than knife-like, but also the edge geometry changes. It's much thicker, steeper up here than it is down here, where you've got a thinner, keener hollow grind, but I put a pretty steep bevel on that. So, paper test. I expect this is going to perform a lot more like a sword than a knife. I love what the white paper and the sunshine does to my light here. Sorry about that. If I cut close to the yeah, it's toothy. If I cut close to the base, yeah, it's kind of sawing through it. Any difference on the other side? I forget which side I fixed. Yeah, this is kind of why I feel like paper testing is not fair for any sword that's not a Japanese razor blade. But let's see how it does on cardboard. Oh yeah, much better. Other side. And that will probably give me a preview of how it's going to do in the cutting tests. Before we get to the test footage, one thing I want to mention is that I went ahead and pried the frog off the sheath. I guess I really did have to pry it. I was very afraid of damaging it. And since then, I've been wearing it just wedged into my belt for cone carry style. And I found that not only is it quite handy, but it just feels lighter than hanging it from the frog from my belt. As I mentioned before, that kind of feels like a full-size sword on my hip. And well, that's what the sheath looks like without. It's actually quite attractive, and that stud does work very well for inside the belt carry. But if you've been following the channel, you know that what I tend to do is show you all the test footage, and then there's kind of a long ramble of breaking it all down. So what I started doing in a prior video is I'll show you one set of tests, we'll break that down, and we'll go from there. Hopefully that might make it more digestible. Let me know what you think, and I will proceed accordingly going forward. But the first set of tests are all about the tip. Thrusting and stabbing in forward and reverse grip first into my pel, which is multiple layers of thick cardboard backed up by a couple of inches of compressed brown paper bag paper up against my redwood target. Which gives me a soft target that gets more and more resistant the deeper I go in, gives me a good sense of penetration and channel, which with this tip geometry was indeed pretty awesome as expected. But I also start to get a sense of kickback into my grip, which I really start to feel when I thrust directly into the redwood. Now that tests two things. One is tip durability. Should the tip collide with anything unexpected, is it easily going to chip or roll? I'm not intentionally trying to destroy it by driving it into the wood, twisting it sideways. And yeah, this tip held up really well, as again expected, because it's pretty well reinforced. But this really does give me a sense of what that kickback feels like. Does my hand stay put? Any uncomfortable collisions? And yes, into the harder media, I definitely started to feel, well, the sharp corners of the guard. It wasn't bad, though. And finally, I tested into my archery target. Which is soft media that's uniform. Definitely see how the blade penetrates as it gets deep, and yeah, it was pretty effective into that media as well. Then we move on to the edge. First test, the bamboo test. Now I mentioned I did put a micro roll on that edge, chopping up some branches, so I was a little worried about some damage from that test, which is me intentionally trying to induce chip or roll on a fragile edge by hitting it at different angles, including some bad ones, but surprisingly held up just fine. The other thing I'm getting out of that test is I'm hitting it with the speed, rhythm, pressure I would normally use when I'm fencing. And yeah, this is a quick, nimble weapon, kind of as expected, but at the same time, it hit that bamboo target pretty hard. Then, cutting. As I mentioned in previous videos, I use cardboard panels which give me similar resistance to water bottles and things like that. Also, that target stand is that vise is just sitting on the stand, so a bad cut will knock it off. But its general performance, very similar to what I got out of the Cinquedea. Yeah, it's a pretty good cutter. It does perform like a short sword, and I also did tip cutting. And yeah, that tip is pretty awesome at tip cutting. And then I put it to some other use. One of the things I did in a previous video, actually with the Cinquedea, was I had some trimmings off my Indian pear, which are basically long, thin, very tough, very flexible straight branches. They're about 3/8, 3/4 of an inch thick, and yeah, just sailed right through those with no problem. As I mentioned, I chopped up some branches. I did some other chopping just to see what chopping would be like with it. Does it function at all like a Bowie knife or other sizable knife? And the answer is pretty much not really. I could make it work if it's the only tool that I had. It's just kind of choppy, but again, not nearly as choppy as something like a Bowie knife or some of my other more dedicated choppy knives. I also tried to do some fine carving with it.
Again, probably not the tool you're ever going to use, but what if for some bizarre reason it was the only one you had? And the answer is I definitely want something better than the factory edge, at least.
This edge, especially the one that came from the factory, just not slicey carby at all. Choppy, yes. But then I tried to do other utility tasks like I would do with a Bowie knife, like making feathers and carving stakes and stuff like that. And yeah, this just...
Well, let's say it's all you had. Definitely leave something to be desired.
As is, I could improve this edge, but it didn't perform for me as a utility tool. Again, if I didn't have another tool, I could make this one work, but it was far from ideal as a tool. But how is it as a weapon? As a final note, with all that chopping I did, and when I'm branch chopping, I'm basically putting the branches on my block and chopping like it's a cleaver. With all of that chopping and some of the other impact tests I did, first, nothing loosened up. So kudos to the build. But, okay, we talked about some of the corners down here. If I choked down to get, well, more length impetus out of the blade, yeah, I really started feeling them quickly. I was doing it without a glove, but if I choked up, pretty much avoided that entirely, and even with that extended branch rendering, didn't have any discomfort to speak of. I'm going to divide up the Marshall handling into 4 sections, but first, you might notice that I did make a change or two to the friendly and took it out to the shop. Evened out that ledge where the grip wasn't matching up quite with the fuller, and also took some of the sharp corners off down here on the grip and a little bit on the pommel. Of course, that took off the black paint. leaving me with sort of a tan-colored wood. So I put some stain on it. I put some lacquer on it. I think I like the way it looks, but more importantly, I like the way it feels, which is important for handling. One last thing before we get into Marshall handling, I did promise to make some comparisons with other large Marshall knives. And the obvious place to start would be with the recently reviewed Cinque Dea. As a matter of fact, at the end of the review of this, I kind of compared the two because how this performed inspired me to get this. They are similar length, but obviously this is a lot broader and, yes, more massive. So it does hit harder in the cut. But I also talked about how using it as a martial weapon, especially using it as a companion weapon to a sword, I felt that the mass might make it a bit sluggish in response, especially if I'm up against something fast like a rapier or a small sword. This is a lot quicker and more nimble in hand, and interestingly enough, in the thrusting tests and cutting soft targets, these performed very, very similarly. So I may be able to get a lot of the functionality of this without its weight by going with this. But let's go to some single-edged options, starting with, well, another massive monster, the cold steel rifleman's knife. This weighs pretty much the same as the Cinque Dea, so significantly more than the Toothpick, even though it's an inch and change shorter. So yeah, in hand, it feels a lot more massive, which makes it choppier. Therefore, potentially a good utility chopper, which is what I've been using it for. But this is another one I've been using as a companion to a sword. And I am a bit concerned that it might be a bit sluggish, but the mass of a blade like this would be better at potentially stopping a, well, weapon that has impetus behind it, like a saber backsword broadsword. How about knives that have more of a buoy profile? All right, this is where it gets interesting. I'm not going to do any of the knives that are significantly lighter than this because their handling characteristics are going to be different. But weapons that are a similar size and actually, well, because they have more blade, are a bit heavier. Starting with the Natchez. Natchez is an inch and change shorter. It is a couple of ounces heavier. But interestingly, the weight distribution, the balance, I don't really feel much difference between these blades in terms of balance and handling. If I ignore the differences in the grip shapes and just move them around out here with my eyes closed, yeah, these actually feel, move, respond in very similar ways. But obviously, this is a much better cutter, slasher, chopper than this is. Another one that's surprisingly similar. 1917. It is a couple of ounces heavier and just a shave shorter. But again, in hand, if I ignore the difference in the grip shapes, moving them around out here, they feel very similar. Now, this one definitely does feel a bit more blade forward and therefore choppier, and yeah, as a utility chopper slasher cutter, much better knife than something like this. But one final comparison that's interesting, I could actually go smaller in a cold steel buoy because they overbuild them so much. If we take a look at the Wild West, okay, that is a significantly shorter blade, but it's still a couple of ounces heavier. And I really do feel it in the belly of the blade. Yeah, it is blade forward. All right, finally, the four categories of use I'm thinking of start with having this in a forward grip as your primary and, well, only a weapon. Now, that doesn't mean you're not using the rest of yourself to deal with whatever situation you're in, but let's say you've just got the one blade. Now, that could be in a handshake grip, hammer grip, or thumb grip. Works awesome in all of those orientations. We've already determined that the tip is great for thrusting, very sword-like. So using it in a handshake or a thumb grip to do those longer, straighter actions, or canting it back at something more like a hammer grip or the thumb version of the hammer grip for doing those closer range, more powerful around corner stabbing actions. Yeah, really, really effective. Plus, very good at tip slashing. Very good potentially at even chopping, hitting. Yeah, it rocks in the hand very nicely for snap cutting. And I have a full false edge for back cutting. This is also another place a thumb grip comes in handy because, yeah, I can certainly do back cuts in something like a handshake grip, but shifting quickly to a thumb grip gives me a little bit more range with those. Kind of like what you'd get with a long sword. Also, I feel like, well, I've got a nice pommel for an impact tool at close range. Might even be able to punch with the guard. But I do have plenty of blade length and, yes, even mass that I would feel confident not only striking with the flat, but parrying and displacing, intercepting another weapon, using it defensively. Now, how much is that guard going to work for me or not? We'll come back to that. Because the next category of application I wanted to talk about is, okay, let's pair this with something in your other hand as an improvised or actual dedicated pairing device. That could be something like a cloak, poncho, Eskrima Kyoya style, coat wrapped around your arm, something else you can use as a pairing device, or yeah, an actual dedicated pairing device like a shield or a buckler. Yeah, this would make a great combination. Next category, let me shift this to the offhand and consider how it would work as a companion to something longer like a sword. I already kind of talked about this with the comparison with the Cinque Dea. I have been using the Cinque Dea and the rifleman's knife as a companion for weapons like this. Having a more massive blade gives me some measure of confidence that I might be able to stop something that has good blade mass behind it, like backsword, broadsword, saber, but the heavier weapons aren't going to be quite as quick against something fast like rapier, smallsword. This one would be more nimble. But how much guard do I really have here, functionally speaking? Well, using it as a parrying dagger, I'm going to go with thumb grip, hide my thumb behind the shadow of the blade, and, okay, I got a little bit, I'm going to say. I would be a little nervous about that. I might want a bigger guard, but having a smaller guard makes it, well, more carryable than something that's got massive quillins. So it's a give and take. Probably not something I'm going to choose on purpose to go into a dual weapon, well, duel, but if it happened to be what I was carrying, it would be something I would feel like I could definitely make some use out of. And should I get within offensive range of using my secondary, yeah, I would feel pretty confident using it that way as well. Which gets me to, okay, other things I could pair this with. Not a sword, but perhaps a hawk or boarding axe. Yeah, also would be a great potential combination, and yes, you can use something like a hawk with your companion weapon in forward grips, but one of the ways I was trained to use this combination that I really like is with the companion weapon, usually a buoy, in a reverse grip, which means we need to talk about finally how this is going to operate for me in a reverse grip. And that means first we have to get there. All right, so it is too big and chunky for me to risk finger twirling. I'm not even really comfortable with pinch flipping it without feeling like I might drop it tip first into my foot, which would be a really bad day. Even though, yes, if I am just training and feeling kind of lazy, especially if I happen to have something in my other hand at the time, yeah, this pommel shape does make a decent pinch flip. It's not the smoothest thing. I do still feel a risk I might drop it. Definitely not something I would want to do under pressure, under adrenaline. And as I've mentioned, never transition a knife when you're even remotely within reach of an opponent, and always think about what adrenaline is doing to kill your fine motor movement. But once it's in the reverse grip, two-handed, okay, yes, I could certainly slash with it, stab with it, back cut with it, all of that, but it's getting into that length range where this is kind of long and awkward for me. Kind of like reverse gripping a sword, but there are uses for a sword in reverse grip, believe it or not. Think about a rondel dagger. If I happen to be in a grappling range and manage to get this point in a gap and drive it in, yeah, that would be really effective. Manipulating it for slashing and things like that out here, yeah, it feels kind of awkward. But paired with a hawk specifically, a couple of things you might do with this. One, emergency pairing device if something gets past your primary. That can also be enhanced if I laid the blade flat along my forearm. I've definitely got something there. Even though my fingers are exposed, that is an emergency protocol. But one of the ways I found that a buoy can be very effective this way, and I actually usually hold it with the edge towards me, is if someone gets past my primary, or I've used the hooking action of the hawk to control my opponent's weapon to get in close with my secondary, if I can get my opponent within the arc of this tip in some way, that can be a very quick and devastating attack, even if I just make sloppy contact with my target. So yeah, very effective possibilities of combination. But again, I think if I had the choice, I would probably go with one of my buoys rather than this. But it doesn't mean I hate this. I actually like it quite a bit. One final note I think I mentioned, I've got a little bit of ricasso. Would I finger the guard? I don't feel the need to do it for snap cutting at all or for tip control. But one place I might use it, one of the functions of a sub-hilt, would be if I happen to bury this into target media and was struggling to get it out, put your finger up here to give you more pull. Possibility. Anyway, okay, this video has gotten really long. We've covered a lot. Let's get our conversation going. If you have this, other Arkansas toothpicks or sizable double-edged knives, keep those recommendations coming. But as always, thank you so much for watching, liking, subscribing, following my journey, putting up with my madness. And I hope to see you back for, okay, I really promise this time, the next thing you're going to see is going to be a hatchet or a hawk.